Imagine waking up in the middle of the night to the metallic sound of chains dragging across the floor. The cold air cuts into your skin, but what truly paralyzes you is fear. You know you are about to face the most feared punishment in all of slavery. A torment so cruel that few ever lived to tell the tale. Your bare feet touch the damp ground as rough hands shove you forward. Around you, silent eyes watch, not out of a lack of compassion, but because terror keeps them frozen. Today, you will discover the truth that almost no one dares to reveal. How this punishment was carried out, why it became the greatest weapon of intimidation for the masters, and the rare stories of survival. Prepare yourself to travel back in time, feel the tension in the air, and understand how a single act of brutality could dominate hundreds of lives. What you are about to hear is not just history. It is a cry that crosses centuries and still echoes to this day. To grasp the weight and cruelty of this punishment, we must go back in time and look at the setting in which it emerged. Slavery, more than just an economic system, was a mechanism of total control, where every detail of a slave's life was defined by the master. From sunrise to sunset, the routine was marked by exhausting labor, constant surveillance, and punishments that went far beyond physical pain. And among all forms of punishment, there was one that stood out not only for its violence, but for the terror it instilled even before it was carried out. On farms, sugar mills, and plantations scattered throughout the colonies, rumors about this torment spread from mouth to mouth. It didn't matter if you were newly arrived or had been born in the slave quarters. Everyone knew that if your name was called for it, the chances of returning alive were minimal. It was the message the masters made sure to spread: obedience or a slow death. Documents from the time, travelers' letters, and missionaries' accounts describe slavery not only as an exploitation of labor, but as a state of constant vigilance. Any gesture interpreted as rebellion, from being late to the fields to speaking without permission, could be grounds for the punishment to be applied. And often, no real reason was even necessary. Mere suspicion or the need to set an example for others was enough. The masters understood perfectly that violence had a strategic role. It was not just about punishing someone who had committed an offense, but about spreading fear like an invisible poison, capable of paralyzing any attempt at resistance. Thus, the most feared punishment became a spectacle of horror, calculated to affect everyone who witnessed it. It is important to understand that at that time, the law was always on the master's side. In many regions, he had the legal right to punish his slaves in whatever way he deemed necessary. This meant there was no protection, no recourse, no justice for those who suffered. And the most perverse aspect, punishments were often carried out in public areas of the plantation in front of everyone, so that fear would spread like fire through dry straw. The physical structure of the plantations also contributed to the terror. There were specific areas set apart, known as punishment places. There, the silence was heavy, broken only by the sound of chains, shouted orders, and screams of pain that echoed all the way to the big house. For the slaves, passing through these places, even without being punished, was enough to send a chill down the spine. It was a constant reminder that their lives did not belong to them. This particular punishment was reserved for situations considered serious by the masters. But seriousness was a subjective concept, depending solely on the owner's mood or intent. And here's an important detail. The more cruel and theatrical the punishment, the greater its effect on everyone else. That is why the punishment was neither quick nor simple. It was designed to last, to be remembered, to become a living legend passed down from generation to generation within the slave quarters. For those living under this regime, merely hearing the sound of certain chains or seeing an overseer heading to the storage room for instruments was enough to set panic in motion. It was as if the entire body already anticipated the pain even before it began. And that anticipation, that constant fear, was an essential part of the power the master held. Looking at this context, it becomes clear that the most feared punishment was not just a tool of discipline, but a psychological weapon. It shaped behaviors, crushed rebellions before they began, and ensured that the system remained intact. It was not only about punishing a body, it was about dominating a soul. And, as we will see in the next chapter, the terror began long before the first blow. The scene that took shape before the punishment, the way everyone was forced to watch, and the tension that spread through the slave quarters created a suffocating atmosphere where every second seemed to announce the worst. The terror of the most feared punishment began long before the first strike. It built slowly, in layers, like a storm announcing itself in the distance, with muffled thunder and heavy clouds on the horizon. Among the enslaved, the mere rumor that tomorrow there will be punishment was enough to plunge the entire quarters into silence. Conversations stopped, eyes turned away, and even the air seemed heavier, harder to breathe. The routine, already marked by exhausting labor, became even more unbearable. Every step of the overseers was watched closely as people tried to guess who would be the next victim. Many times, the chosen one already knew their fate hours or even days in advance, living that time like a countdown to hell. Some tried to keep their heads held high, others withdrew into themselves, but all felt the same crushing pressure. When the moment came, the ritual began early. The overseer appeared at the door of the quarters, with the name on his lips and a hard look, leaving no room for questions. The call was dry, short, like a sentence. The enslaved person would rise, feeling the weight of every eye upon them. Some companions avoided looking, as if they feared that a simple exchange of glances could attract the same fate. The path to the place of punishment was an essential part of the spectacle. Chains on the ankles, ropes on the wrists, and the metallic sound echoing across the yard announced to all that the execution of yet another lesson was about to begin. The other enslaved people were forced to stop their work and form a kind of involuntary audience. There was no escape, no place to hide. Attendance was mandatory. The setting chosen for the punishment also played a role in the psychological terror. It was usually an isolated area, but still visible enough for everyone to see. Some plantations had a whipping post, or a stake fixed in the center, surrounded by hard-packed dirt, stained with dark marks that time could not erase. These marks, silent and permanent, were reminders that this was not just a place, it was an altar of pain. Before it began, the overseer gave short, sharp orders while the assistants prepared the instruments. This was the moment when the tension reached its peak. The sound of ropes being tightened, of chains clanking, and of steel cutting through the air served as a prelude to death. For the one about to be punished, each of these sounds cut into them like invisible blades. It was not uncommon for the master of the big house to appear and watch. His presence, often accompanied by family members or guests, turned the punishment into a performance of absolute power. The cold, distant stares reinforced the message that life had no value beyond its labor. The gathered enslaved people, even if they were not the ones punished, suffered in silent anguish. Many clasped their hands, others clenched their teeth, and some prayed quietly, begging for the pain to be brief. But they knew it would not be. The most feared punishment was never meant to be quick. It was calculated to prolong suffering and leave marks, not only on the body, but also on the minds of all who witnessed it. In that setting, time seemed to stretch. The minutes before the first blow felt like hours. The smell of earth mixed with cold sweat, and even the birds seemed to go silent. It was as if the entire plantation held its breath, waiting for the moment when violence would become inevitable. And that is precisely where the punishment revealed its first face. Before it touched the skin, it had already penetrated the soul. The fear of being there, chained, exposed in front of everyone, was the beginning of a destruction that went far beyond the flesh. And in the instant the overseer raised his hand to deliver the first blow, the world around seemed to vanish, leaving only the certainty that nothing, absolutely nothing, would ever be the same again. In the next chapter, we will enter the core of brutality, the cruel method itself. You will see, step by step, how it was carried out, which instruments were used, and why the process itself seemed designed to extract not only the physical strength, but also the dignity of the one enduring it. When the overseer gave the signal, the atmosphere seemed to change temperature. The air grew heavier, and everyone knew that from that moment on, there was no turning back. The enslaved person was led to the center of the punishment area, usually a solid wooden whipping post or a tall stake set firmly in the ground. Every step was heavy, accompanied by the dry sound of chains. The place smelled of sweat, leather, and iron, an odor that seared itself into memory. Ropes or iron shackles bound the wrists and ankles tightly. Many times, the body was stretched to its limit, forcing the victim into a position of complete vulnerability. This posture was not only functional for carrying out the punishment, it had the psychological intent of dehumanizing, turning the person into something displayed, like an object. The main instrument varied depending on the region and the time, but it always bore the mark of cruelty. In many cases, a rawhide whip was used, with strips soaked in salt or tipped with metal, designed to tear the skin and strike the muscle. Others used hard wooden rods capable of breaking bones. In even more brutal punishments, heated iron instruments were applied directly to the flesh, leaving scars that would never fade. The first blow was rarely the most painful. At the beginning, the body still had the strength to resist, and the mind sought some escape, a thought, a memory, to endure it. But the punishment was not meant to be endured. With each blow, the skin split further, blood began to flow, and the pain became nearly unbearable. The whip cracked in the air before striking the flesh, producing a sound that etched itself into the minds of all present. The rhythm was calculated. It was not a rapid sequence, but spaced-out strikes, allowing the victim to feel each wave of pain until the next impact. Between one blow and the next, the overseer sometimes made deliberately long pauses just to prolong the suffering and heighten the terror. The silence in those moments was so heavy that even the breathing of the spectators seemed audible. In some cases, the punishment included verbal humiliation. The overseer shouted insults, the master watched with a cold expression, and any attempt at a cry or plea was taken as a sign of weakness, something that perversely only encouraged more violence. There was no compassion, no mercy. The goal was clear: to break both body and spirit. For those watching, the impact was profound. Enslaved children were forced to see as a form of lesson. Strong men lowered their heads, and women held back tears, aware that any reaction could put them in the same position. The punishment, though inflicted on one person, was a spectacle of collective control. As the minutes passed, the victim began to lose strength. The legs trembled, the body leaned forward, and many times it was necessary for assistants to hold them upright so that the punishment could continue. With each blow, the body seemed to react less, not because the pain diminished, but because exhaustion and physical shock began to take over. In some documented cases, the torment lasted until the victim lost consciousness. This did not mean the end. On the contrary, many times they were revived only to continue receiving the blows. The number of strikes varied, but it always exceeded any human limit. The goal was not merely to injure, but to leave a permanent mark, both physically and emotionally. The final scene of this process was almost always the same: the bloodied, weakened body being released and collapsing to the ground. Some were dragged back to the slave quarters, others were left exposed so that all could see the consequences of defying the system. There were cases in which the wounded received no medical treatment, left at the mercy of infections and fevers that days later led to death. The most disturbing part is that for the masters, this was not seen as gratuitous cruelty. It was discipline. This perverse justification allowed unimaginable acts to be normalized within that society. And for that reason, the most feared punishment maintained its place as the most effective weapon of submission. But as we will see in the next chapter, the physical pain, as terrible as it was not the only legacy left by this torment. The immediate consequences on the body were brutal, but the psychological effects and invisible scars could last a lifetime and even be passed on to future generations. When the final blow was finally given, the silence that followed was not one of relief, but of shock. The punished body, once upright, now seemed to collapse under its own weight. The legs gave out, the arms hung limp, and the chest heaved for air, as if each breath was a fight for life. The skin, torn in multiple places, displayed deep cuts that crossed like a map of pain. Blood dripped slowly, mixing with sweat and the dust of the ground. The victim rarely had the strength to remain standing. Many times they were dragged by other enslaved people to a corner of the quarters or simply left lying in the yard, exposed to the sun or the rain. The body trembled involuntarily, not only from the pain, but from physical shock. This state, which we now know to be the collapse of the body in the face of extreme trauma, was at the time ignored or, worse, seen as a natural part of the process. The injuries went far beyond surface cuts. The blows struck muscles, nerves, and in some cases even bones. Bruises formed quickly, darkening the skin in shades of purple and black. There were cases where ribs were broken, making breathing even more difficult and painful. The loss of blood, combined with physical exhaustion, placed the life of the punished person in immediate danger. But perhaps the most calculated cruelty lay in the abandonment that followed. Most of the time, there was no medical care whatsoever. The wounds were left exposed, vulnerable to infections that, without treatment, could spread quickly throughout the body. High fevers, chills, and delirium were common in the following days. Many enslaved people did not die at the moment of the punishment, but succumbed slowly, consumed by infection and weakness. The physical mark left by the punishment was permanent. Wide, irregular scars scored the back, arms, or legs, becoming a silent record of the violence suffered. For the masters, these marks were like a warning to others, a constant reminder that the same fate could be repeated. For the victim, they were open wounds in memory, filled with shame and humiliation, even when the guilt was never theirs. The pain did not end when the body began to heal. Simple movements, like standing up, sitting down, or carrying weight, could trigger sharp pains for weeks or months. In extreme cases, the damage was so severe that it resulted in permanent disability, impaired joints, atrophied muscles, limited movement. Forced labor, however, was rarely interrupted. Even while injured, the enslaved were forced to continue their tasks, dragging themselves through the fields or trying to remain upright in the mill. Refusal, or the physical inability to work, could be interpreted as disobedience and, ironically, lead to more punishments. It was a perverse cycle in which the victim never had the space to recover. The brutality also left an immediate impact on those who watched. Upon seeing the state of their punished companion, the other enslaved people felt the weight of the threat hanging over them. Each scar was a living message of warning. The sight of the torn body planted seeds of fear that grew in the silence of the nights, when the distant sound of chains or heavy footsteps reignited traumatic memories. This collective impact was an essential part of the success of this punishment in the oppressor's logic. It did not need to be applied frequently to maintain its effect. It was enough that everyone knew what it was capable of and had seen even once the immediate result on a human body. But the marks that could not be seen were often the deepest. Public humiliation, the loss of dignity and the feeling of helplessness eroded the mind just as the blows destroyed the body. And it is at this point that physical violence turned into something even more enduring, a psychological trauma that never healed. In the next chapter, we will cross this invisible boundary and understand how the most feared punishment did not end when the final blow was struck. We will explore how fear and pain took root in the minds of victims and witnesses, shaping behaviors and silently imprisoning hearts and thoughts for an entire lifetime. The body can recover from wounds, but the mind carries scars that never close. For those who endured the most feared punishment, physical pain was only the beginning of a long and silent mental torture. Public humiliation, exposure before everyone, and the impossibility of defense created a wound in self-esteem that slowly corroded a person's identity. Even after weeks or months, the mere sound of a whip, the clinking of chains, or the shout of an overseer could trigger trembling, cold sweats, and a racing heart. The victims often developed a constant state of alertness. They lived as if the punishment could return at any moment. Sleeping deeply became almost impossible. The slightest noise at night could make them wake up in fright. Disturbing dreams, reliving the moment of punishment, were common. This condition, which we now recognize as trauma from extreme violence, was invisible to the masters and overseers, but absolutely real to those who carried that weight. The impact was not limited to those who directly suffered the punishment. Those who watched were also marked. Children, forced to witness the scene, learned from an early age that their lives did not belong to them. They grew up in fear, internalizing the idea that blind obedience was the only way to survive. Men and women, upon seeing a companion destroyed physically and emotionally, began to measure every word, every gesture, as if they were living on a minefield. This climate of constant fear was one of the central objectives of the punishment. It worked like an invisible prison. It was not necessary to chain everyone, because the memory of what could happen was enough to keep everyone in line. The trauma spread like a silent disease, transmitted from look to look, from a story told in the dark to young, attentive ears. Public humiliation also had a devastating effect on social cohesion among the enslaved. Instead of unity, an atmosphere of distrust and isolation was created. Some, out of fear, avoided offering support or comfort to the victim, afraid of being associated with them. This weakened the bonds of solidarity, which were essential to resist oppression. The oppressor knew this and exploited that division. There was yet another cruel aspect, the internalization of guilt. Many punished individuals began to believe that in some way they deserved the punishment, even when the accusation was unjust. This feeling eroded the ability to dream of freedom or dignity. The person began to see themselves not as a full human being, but as someone marked forever, destined to live under another's control. A few were able, over time, to transform that pain into fuel to resist or escape. But for the majority, the weight was so crushing that the mere idea of rebellion seemed unattainable. Fear became part of the routine, shaping every choice and limiting every step. The trauma also had indirect physical consequences. Constant tension affected health, loss of appetite, weakened immune system, and stress-related illnesses were common. A person lived in exhaustion, even without physical effort, because the mind never rested. And perhaps most disturbing, this psychological legacy could cross generations. Children and grandchildren inherited not only stories, but also behaviors shaped by fear. The stooped posture, the low voice, the habit of avoiding eye contact with figures of authority, all this could be passed down, even without the new generations having experienced the punishment directly. In the next chapter, we will leave this universe of pain and enter a rare but real territory, the cases of survival. Stories of men and women who, against all odds, endured the most feared punishment and found ways to keep living, to escape, or even to win their freedom. These stories are few, but they carry immense power to show that even in the densest darkness, there were sparks of resistance. Amid the sea of lives cut short by the most feared punishment, there were a few that escaped the expected ending. Surviving it was not only a matter of physical strength, it was also a game of luck, mental endurance, and many times unexpected intervention. These stories, rare as diamonds in the mud, circulated discreetly among the enslaved, feeding a spark of hope. One of the most well-known accounts among the elders of the quarters told of Joachim, a tall, robust man known for his skill in handling heavy tools at the mill. Unjustly accused of deliberately breaking a part of the grinder, he was condemned to punishment. Many believed he would not return alive, but after hours of torment, Joachim managed to remain standing until the last blow. It is said that even staggering, he kept his gaze steady, staring at the overseer with a mix of defiance and silent dignity. He survived, though with deep scars and limited movement in his right arm. His story spread as a reminder that not all bent completely. Another case told of Felicia, a dark-skinned woman with a piercing gaze, small in stature but with an inner strength that seemed to defy logic. After being accused of stealing food, she was taken to the whipping post. Her resistance did not lie in enduring the pain without crying. She screamed, begged, and cried, but she survived. And a few months later, she managed to escape, aided by other enslaved people who admired her courage. Felicia was last seen walking north, and her story became a symbol of a successful escape. Surviving did not mean coming out unscathed. Many who endured carried the consequences for the rest of their lives: atrophied muscles, difficulty walking, impaired vision. But for them, continuing to breathe was already an act of rebellion. Every day alive was a silent victory against the system that tried to erase them. Some survival stories included almost miraculous elements, like that of a young man named Antonio. Punished until he lost consciousness, taken for dead, he was left in the field. During the night, other enslaved people found him and hid him in an improvised shelter in the woods, caring for him with herbs and cold compresses. It took weeks for him to stand again, but when he returned to the quarters, his presence was received as if a ghost had come back. These survivors, however, were cautious. They knew that any open display of pride or resistance could put them back in the crosshairs. Thus they lived with the awareness that their freedom was limited and that their survival was, at the same time, both a blessing and a condemnation. The impact of these stories was not only in the details of how each one endured, but in the effect they had on others. They served as reminders that, even in the worst conditions, there was still room for courage. Some said that upon hearing about Joachim, Felicia, or Antonio, they felt stronger, even if only momentarily. These narratives, passed from mouth to mouth, acted as emotional fuel, something the masters could never fully control. It was risky to tell these stories. The overseers and foremen knew that examples of resistance could ignite the spirit of rebellion. That is why any conversation about survivors had to be held in low voices, often at night, far from dangerous ears. Yet they persisted, crossing time like invisible threads of memory and resistance. Some survivors years later achieved freedom, whether through purchase, inheritance, or final escape. And when they could, they told their stories publicly, denouncing the brutality they had endured. These accounts, recorded in letters, newspapers, or books, became valuable historical evidence that slavery was not just a labor system, but a mechanism of human destruction. For those who remained in captivity, knowing that someone had survived the punishment and lived on was a reminder that oppression was not invincible. Even if the chances were minimal, the mere existence of these stories fed a kind of hope that the masters could never understand. But as we will see in the next chapter, the memory of these survivors and the trauma of those who were lost do not belong only to the past. The echo of this torment has crossed centuries, finding parallels in the way that, even today, violence and psychological control still manifest in different corners of the world. The most feared punishment of slavery is not just a story from the past. It is a distorted mirror that, if we look closely, still reflects shadows that span centuries. The logic behind this torment, to destroy a body in order to control a mind and subjugate a community, remains alive even if it has changed form. Today, in many parts of the world, physical violence has been replaced by silent yet equally destructive forms: public humiliation, exploitation, discrimination, and abuses that corrode dignity in invisible ways. Fear, which was the essence of that punishment, continues to be used as a tool of control. No longer iron chains or wooden stocks, but veiled threats, social and economic barriers, systems that keep people trapped in a reality they did not choose. And just like in the past, many believe there is no way out, until a voice, a story, or an example of resistance shows that it is possible to break the cycle. The memory of the punishment also survives in the invisible marks passed down from generation to generation. These are not only inherited physical scars, but behaviors shaped by trauma: the fear of speaking loudly, hesitation in the face of authority, difficulty in fully trusting others. These are emotional wounds that do not heal with time, but can begin to close when the truth is exposed and acknowledged. Remembering these episodes is more than a historical exercise. It is an act of resistance. By telling and hearing these stories, we refuse the erasure that so many tried to impose. We honor those who did not survive, give voice to those who resisted, and show that oppression, no matter how brutal, is never absolute. The most remarkable thing is that, even under such an extreme regime of violence, there were acts of humanity and courage. Enslaved people who risked their own lives to help a punished companion, who hid fugitives, who kept alive the memory of those who were gone. These small flames of resistance prevented the darkness from being total. Today, when we see cases of injustice, discrimination, and oppression, we must recognize the same mechanism at work: the use of fear to maintain control. And just as in the past, the answer lies in breaking the silence, strengthening the bonds of solidarity, and preserving collective memory. It is not about living trapped in the past, but about using the past as a warning and a compass for the present. The most feared punishment of slavery did not end with abolition. It left bitter lessons about how far human cruelty can go, but also about the resilience that can bloom even in the most barren soil. When we look back, we cannot only feel horror, we must feel responsibility. Responsibility to tell, to teach, to protect, and to fight so that nothing similar ever happens again, in any form, anywhere. And that responsibility is shared. It does not belong only to the descendants of those who suffered, but to all who believe that human dignity is non-negotiable. Because, as history shows us, when fear is the law, courage is the only answer capable of changing the course of things. In the next and final chapter, we will end this journey with a strong and emotional message that not only concludes the video, but leaves the viewer with the feeling that something must be done now. What you have just heard is not merely a historical account. It is a powerful reminder that when human dignity is threatened, it must be defended at all costs. The most feared punishment of slavery destroyed lives, broke bodies, and tried to silence voices, but it could not erase the truth. That truth has reached us because there were those who resisted, who told, who refused to let silence be the last word. If this story has moved you, do not let it end here. Share this video so that more people can know the brutality that existed and understand that it cannot, in any form, be repeated. Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and join me in the next stories, because there is still much to be revealed. And each revelation is a weapon against forgetting. Honoring the memory of those who suffered is more than remembering. It is acting so that in the present no one else has to endure anything similar. The past calls to us, and the answer begins now.